In the past week, South Africans have been marking the death of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, Prime Minister of the Zulu Nation. I'm Audrey Brown, and in this edition of the documentary from the BBC World Service, I'll be looking back at the life and career of this controversial South African politician. Alongside Nelson Mandela, Mangosuthu Buthelezi was probably one of the best-known political figures from South Africa in the 20th century, albeit for slightly different reasons. Whereas Nelson Mandela was revered for sacrificing his life to free all South Africans from white political and social domination, Mangosuthu Buthelezi's legacy is less clear-cut. He was known for opposing the apartheid government in the international arena. But he was also accused of complicity with that very regime to further his own political influence back home.
First, he was a family man, a father figure in his own family. And beyond that, he was a father to all of us and many whom he assisted to get education and jobs.
Wily, self-centered, charismatic, can be very petulant. He wished to inscribe his own name into history in a very particular way. He wanted to be remembered as the voice of the Zulu.
Short temper, very articulate, very decisive, and did not suffer fools very easily.
He wanted to be an actor on the national stage, but at the same time, he wanted, to be firmly rooted in that Zulu royal politics and his attentions in his politics, which of course were unsustainable over time.
Mangosuthu Buthelezi 1928 in Mahlabathini, in what was then Natal, a province in the Union of South Africa. He was born into Zulu royalty, his mother a princess, his father chief of the Buthelezi clan. Shalom Bata is a historian and expert on the Zulu royal family.
The Zulu are the largest nation in South Africa. There is over 20 million of them. And they're only not limited to the geographical area of South Africa. They go as far as Zimbabwe, Mozambique. There's some Zulus in Kenya, in Zambia. As an empire, they were formed by King Shaka. He subjugated, I think, 72 kingdoms. So he decided to say to people, we are now all going to be called the Zulu. Then you can use your surname after that. So that's how the empire was formed.
The Zulu nation is led by a king. The king has councillors and representatives of the different families and clans that make up the nation. Individuals within these groups jockey for position, power, and the king's ear. Mangosuthu Buthelezi managed to do that with particular success, styling himself the late King Zwelithini's prime minister. He also carried the title Prince, which might be surprising, given that the Zulu are patrilineal and his mother was royal, not his father. So how did he lay claim to the title? Shalom Bata explains his lineage, accompanied by music played by Mr. Buthelezi's mother, Princess Magogo, a celebrated performer and composer of Zulu songs.
Oh, shit. The royal family of the Zulu, one of the wives was a Buthelezi woman. She was married to King Shaka's father. So because Makoko was a blue blood princess, even though she was wife number 10, she automatically becomes the main wife or the principal wife. That is why the children will then become royal in the Buthelezi lineage as well. So that is why he's a chief under the Buthelezi and also a prince because he's got blue blood from the mother's side.
Gacha Buthelezi, as he was then known, was educated at a mission school and went on to study at the prestigious Fort Hare University from 1948 to 1950. Fort Hare in the Eastern Cape was the breeding ground for many leaders of the anti-apartheid and anti-colonial movement of Southern Africa and further afield. Thandeka Qubule Mbeki is a journalist, author, and lecturer.
He had encountered many of the liberation leaders and much of the liberation ethos at Fort Hare, which was a hotbed of black nationalist thought and radical thought. And he seemed to emerge and understand those kind of politics, having been exposed to them in the Eastern Cape.
After being thrown out of Fort Hare in 1952 for taking part in student demonstrations, Gacha Buthelezi married Irene Mzila, a student nurse from Johannesburg, whom he'd met a few years earlier at a wedding. The African National Congress was one of the main organizations resisting white supremacy and apartheid, which had become official government policy in 1948 when the National Party won an election. Mr. Buthelezi was a member of the ANC and law student at the start of his career. His relationship with the ANC soured in later years. But according to Reverend Musa Zondi, a mentee and close political ally, Mr. Buthelezi's political vision was sharpened when he encountered the ANC kingmaker Walter Sisulu on a visit to the Indian and African-led Lakhani law chambers, where the ANC had their offices in Durban. Mr. Sisulu was the then still unbanned ANC Secretary General. The story goes that this encounter changed the trajectory of Gacha Buthelezi's life. This is how Musa Zondi tells it.
Walter Sisulu said, well, what are your plans, young man? And he said, well, I want to study law in order to defend our people against the hostilities of the regime. And so Walter Sisulu, knowing his history, he said, I think you, as a hereditary chief, you do much better to assist our struggle if you go back to Mahlabatini, your birthplace, and take up your traditional role as a political advisor to the Zulu monarch, because the regime is imposing upon Africans Bantu Authorities Act. And if they manipulate the Zulu people to accept it and take independence a la Pretoria, it would be a hard blow to the entire struggle for liberation.
Walter Sisulu's powers for spotting and developing leaders are legendary. He's also credited as the man who drew Nelson Mandela deeper into the struggle that led both of them to be jailed for life, a fate Mr. Buthelezi escaped. He never went into exile either. His political path was very different. For instance, he was able to steer a course for himself in the Bantu Authority Act, introduced in 1951, which set up territories which denied black South Africans citizenship in the country as a whole. Instead, they were consigned to tribal homelands where they had a form of self-governance that still fell under the overall authority of white rulers. Roger Southall, professor of sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, says Mr. Buthelezi was able to exploit the ambiguity of that relationship to embellish his own reputation and standing.
The other homeland leaders, in essence, were pretty happy to collaborate with the apartheid regime, whereas Buthelezi liked to run a middle course, de facto in a position of compliance and cooperation with the Pretoria government, but on various occasions using the opportunity to claim he was anti-apartheid, and his was a strategy internal to South Africa of using the official machineries against the government.
Well, to me...
This is Mr. Buthelezi speaking in 1973 to the BBC's Panorama as Chief Minister of the Homeland Territory of KwaZulu.
We haven't felt for a single moment that we're wielding any power as a government. For instance, technically speaking, I couldn't invite you to my house for tea unless a white official gave permission.
What powers do you have as KwaZulu?
Well, we have limited legislative power, but I think that for the moment, myself, I feel that I'm yet to be convinced that we're much more than just a puppet show for the moment, I would say.
So, back in the homeland of KwaZulu, the place of the Zulu is what it means, Mr. Buthelezi created what later became the Inkatha Freedom Party, an organization that through its very name appealed to Zulus to bind together in mystic harmony.
The Inkatha liberation movement, led by Gatsha Buthelezi, has 350,000 members. It's bigger even than the Afrikaners Nationalist Party.
And when he formed the IFP in 1975, it was also a deal with his comrades who were now in exile with Oliver Tambo to say, look, as the ANC were operating from outside, we are in the country, let's have an internal wing, if you like. You continue fighting for the ANC using a different name so that we can free our people.
As a homeland leader, Buthelezi refuses to accept so-called independence, as his masters in Pretoria would like. Instead, he works within the system to beat the system, calling for one man, one vote in a federal South Africa.
Back in 1975, Inkatha was sold as a cultural organization in which every member of the Zulu nation was automatically enrolled. It also spoke the language of liberation, with calls for power to the people. But it wasn't always clear who the people were.
Inkatha actually took on the colors of the ANC, which many people felt was quite revolutionary at the time because any insignia, any symbol of the ANC was banned. So the choice and the imagery of the emerging party was that of black unity. It had echoes of African nationalism. It seemed to want to stand out when everybody else was suppressed.
When Inkatha was formed in 1975, the ANC had been banned for 15 years already. Its leadership was in jail or in exile. Mr. Buthelezi appeared to step into the void in South Africa. Abroad, he was actively promoted by leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as the more palatable alternative to Nelson Mandela and the ANC because of his opposition to economic sanctions. But the appearance of unity with the exiled freedom fighters of the ANC didn't last long. In just a few years, cracks started to appear. The historian Shalom Bata puts it down to a difference in strategy and tactics.
Everything was going well until the ANC started, intensifying the armed struggle. And secondly, this international boycott, disinvestment, that made him fall apart with the ANC because he felt black people were without jobs. And then the ANC was saying, look, it's a means to an end. So then they fell apart.
I mean, from 1,000 miles away from here, they can afford to adopt a stance of disinvestment, but I cannot. But I wouldn't deliberately, as a stance, say we must destroy the economy, which I believe in the long run, even after liberation, can be the basis for reconciliation.
But it wasn't just about tactics. The cracks in the facade of unity turned into a chasm as the ANC's members became more militant inside the country, while Mr. Buthelezi appeared to be more complicit with an increasingly violent apartheid regime. He also had control of a police force in his role as chief minister of the Zulu homeland, and he was quite prepared to use those police to quell any opposition to his rule. But the Reverend Musa Zondi, a former MP and the Inkatha Freedom Party's press secretary for many years, disputes this.
Contrary to the popular viewpoint about people who think that under Buthelezi you had to toe just one line, he would say to us, I am firmly for a non-violent democratic opposition against the South African regime, and I'm mobilizing black people to oppose it non-violently and democratically. But if you feel that your contribution could be better in the military wing of either the ANC or the PAC, the border is very porous. You can go through Lesotho or Swaziland. And so there were many others with whom we started who actually did just that.
Pallo Jordan was one of the leading intellectual lights of the African National Congress in exile. He explains how the differences between the ANC and Inkatha became unmanageable.
Strategically, that the ANC had always pursued was that you must isolate the principal enemy, which was the racist government. If there is a political factor like a Prince Buthelezi in the country, who, for whatever reasons, is oppositional to the racist regime, you must try and win them to your side. Prince Buthelezi, in 1979, had a meeting with the president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, and a delegation of leaders of the ANC in London. And they'd more or less come out of that meeting very happy. There's a basis for cooperation here.
But they spoke too soon.
Now, the things that were expected from him, for example, were that he would take a leading role in the campaign for the release of Mandela and all political prisoners. He didn't do that. It was expected also that with respect to the pursuance of a non-racial project, he would take a principal role with respect to that as well. He did not do that. And he went back on virtually everything that had been agreed on.
Chief Buthelezi's memories are slightly different, as he told Tim Sebastian on Hard Talk in 2002.
Difference between us, Mr. Sebastian, was difference on sanctions, because I wouldn't support sanctions. And secondly, because I wouldn't support the armed struggle. You know, in 1979, I went to London, Mr. Sebastian, requested by Mr. Tambo, the then president of the ANC, to talk with him. And because I wouldn't support them, then they portrayed me and vilified me and used the anti-apartheid movement and used the churches against me to vilify me, to call me a traitor and so on.
These differences led to bloodshed. What's more, Inkatha operated openly, holding large rallies, brandishing traditional weapons, capitalizing on their self-professed status as a cultural organization. But the ANC and its affiliates were banned from operating at all. Thandeka Kubule Mbeki was a student activist in the United Democratic Front, a national alliance of anti-apartheid organizations formed to better fight an increasingly vicious apartheid state.
My father was the president of the UDF in Natal. So we formed a youth league in Pietermaritzburg. We formed it before the 1984 launch of the UDF, and we went as a youth group to the launch of the UDF. When we returned, Inkatha began to assail us. They would come up to our meetings, they would break up our meetings, and if we held a mass meeting or a meeting in the hall, they would come up and contest the stage physically with us.
So physical fights, violence.
Yes, a clash of ideas.
The violence got worse as Inkatha clashed with ANC affiliates in the townships of what were then the provinces of Natal and the Transvaal. What's more, there was growing evidence that Inkatha had help from the apartheid regime.
He was not to blame solely, because remember the UDF was saying, let us make South Africa ungovernable. The regime had unleashed all sorts of terror in the townships. Kids weren't going to school, and there were a lot of gangs. There was no legitimate authority in the townships, apart from the use by the police and the SADF and the security forces of guns. So it was a reign of chaos as well as terror. So to say it was entirely Inkatha would be wrong. But on the other hand, you have to remember that the Inkatha vigilantes at times were having training by the security forces. And there were definite instances where the security forces used Inkatha to hit the UDF.
Bring back Nelson Mandela, bring him back home to Soweto.
A big roar of ANC goes up from the crowd. Everybody's now rushing up to the prison gate. And now Mr. Mandela walks through the gate. He's a free man.
In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison and the ANC was unbanned. Negotiations began to dismantle the apartheid system and replace it with a new South Africa. It was a bloody birth. The ANC and Inkatha continued a violent contestation for power.
Too many people are dying here. Too many people.
Typically, it would involve groups of maybe 20, 30, even 100 men sweeping through an ANC district, armed with machetes, with clubs, with firearms, and just butchering anything in front of them.
In 1993, Chris Hani, second only to Mr. Mandela in popularity in the ANC, was assassinated in a transparent attempt to derail the path to freedom. Two white nationalists, Clive Derby-Lewis and the Polish-born Janusz Walusz, were captured, tried, and found guilty of murdering him. But in the hours and days after the shooting, it was touch and go. South Africa was on the verge of an all-out war. Only Nelson Mandela's stature and moral authority could quell the anger South Africans felt at Chris Hani's death. Then, out of the anguish came a commitment, finally, that the first democratic election would be held on the 27th of April, 1994. The world heaved a sigh of relief. South Africa would be free at last. But Chief Buthelezi threw a spanner in the works.
During the transition period, at the end, he was holding out against the agreement around the new constitution. We are not going to participate in the first election. And that would have been extremely problematic because it would have deprived the new constitution and have deprived the election of a considerable degree of legitimacy.
What he put on the table was the recognition of the Zulu monarchy as a special entity that needed to be entrenched in the constitution. And when they did not want to entertain that, he walked away with the whole Zulu delegation. Because the Zulu are so many in number, they realized you cannot go ahead and talk peace in South Africa if the Zulu are not part of it.
It's worth noting that Inkatha and Chief Buthelezi did not represent all Zulus. He didn't even represent the majority of Zulu people in South Africa. In fact, senior members of the ANC, like Jacob Zuma, who would later become president of South Africa, were Zulu. And after holding the whole election to ransom, he did get some concessions to improve Inkatha's representation in the new South Africa.
He got an important concession from the ANC, which has actually proved valuable. But what the ANC and Thabo Mbeki had managed to get at that point was a concession from the opposition that there would simply be one vote. So if you voted nationally for the ANC, if the ANC had got 65% nationally, then it would sweep every province. Buthelezi, as a concession to participate in the election, managed to get 2 votes. So you'd have 1 vote for national, 1 vote for provincial. And that now means you can have more diversity at provincial level. So I think that has been, by default, an important contribution to our post-94 condition.
The changes also gave the king and whoever had his ear direct control over a huge swathe of land in KwaZulu-Natal, a province which is home to a variety of other ethnic groups as well. Chief Buthelezi was a dominant force on the national political stage from the 1970s onwards. He was married to Irene Namzila for 67 years, and together they had 8 children. A deeply religious man, he paid this tribute to her when she died in 2019.
I thank God for her. I thank her for the love that she gave to me, the love she gave to my children. She is strong because if you think of the fact that God had blessed her with 8 children and 5 of them have been buried, we've gone through that together.
2 of their children died in separate car accidents. One of them was just 6 years old. The other died in adulthood. There were further deaths, one from drug-resistant TB and 2 others from HIV/AIDS. After the 1994 election, he was appointed Minister of Home Affairs by President Nelson Mandela. Paulo Jordan was Minister of Post and Telecommunications during this first administration. How would he assess Mr. Buthelezi's political career?
The way I look at Buthelezi myself is as an ambiguous figure who was trying to pursue agendas that necessarily were irreconcilable. He didn't recognize that. At the end of the day, one might say he redeemed himself by pulling back from the brink during that first democratic election, deciding to participate. But I see even that I see as part of this ambiguity in his politics. There is an expression in Yiddish which says you can't ride 2 wagons if you only have one backside. I think he was trying to do that. But of course, he couldn't do it.
And this is the verdict of first Thandeka Kobule and then Roger Southall.
He wished to inscribe his own name into history in a very particular way. He wanted to be remembered as the voice of the Zulu, whether the king liked it or not, and a Democrat who played a role in the construction of a new South Africa.
His legacy, I think, is a very mixed one, but I think overall it is a negative one. I think historians will judge that he was a largely cooperative figure, that he worked against the struggle for liberation in its most meaningful form, and that he was perpetually ambiguous.
In 2019, at the age of 90, Mangosuthu Buthelezi relinquished leadership of the Inkatha Freedom Party, an organization he had led since 1975. Unsurprisingly, he became President Emeritus. How did he see himself looking back over his long and eventful life?
There are few things I wouldn't do again if I was given a chance to repeat them. Like any human being, I have made mistakes for which I ask for forgiveness. But I have no regrets concerning my political career.
That edition of the documentary on the BBC World Service was presented by me, Audrey Brown. It was produced by Julie Ball.